More than half of the potatoes from PEI go to the U.S.
Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously of huge concern.
Talk of tariffs has created uncertainty.
It didn't happen with a bang. No dramatic headlines. No angry speeches. Just a quiet vanishing act. Over 140,000 tons of Canadian potatoes disappeared from U.S. shelves in under 4 months. No one saw it coming. But make no mistake, this wasn't a supply glitch. It was the fallout of a reckless U.S. decision, a 35% tariff slapped on Canadian potato imports in April 2025. No warning, no negotiation, just a brutal tariff spike that torched one of the most stable trade pipelines on the continent. While U.S. diners, grocery stores, and food chains scrambled to find inferior replacements, Ottawa didn't retaliate with tariffs of its own. No press conferences, no sanctions, just silence and strategy. Because behind the scenes, Canada was already inking new deals. Multi-billion-dollar agriculture agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia, while Washington was still trying to figure out why Idaho's shelves looked so bare. This wasn't just about potatoes. It was a message wrapped in silence, and the U.S. never even realized it. And what happens next could shake the foundation of North American food trade. So hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the full story? It's just getting started. The chaos began quietly, like a slow leak in a pressurized system. In April 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced a sudden 35% tariff on all Canadian potato imports, citing vague concerns about market imbalances and unfair subsidies. But economists, trade lawyers, and even domestic producers knew the truth. It was political theater. There was no real consultation, no joint review, just a unilateral blow delivered under the guise of nationalism. And the impact? Immediate and unforgiving. Within weeks, major distributors in Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio reported shortages. Frozen French fries disappeared first, then hash browns, then raw potatoes, especially the high-starch, high-quality varieties Canada had specialized in for decades. By June, over 140,000 tons of Canadian potato supply had vanished from U.S. circulation, replaced with inconsistent imports from Mexico, Eastern Europe, and low-quality domestic surpluses that couldn't match demand. And with that disappearance came price shocks. In some Midwestern states, prices for frozen potatoes jumped 28% in just 45 days. Diners slashed portions or quietly pulled fries from menus altogether. Major fast food chains like Wendy's and Culver's were forced to issue public statements about temporary supply disruptions. Behind closed doors, franchisees were livid. Their margins were shrinking, customers were noticing, and Washington had no solution, just more patriotic slogans. But the real twist? Canada didn't scream. It didn't strike back. It didn't even flinch. Instead, Ottawa executed a move so subtle, so surgical, that most Americans didn't even register it. They scaled back. Not just potatoes, but a broader recalibration of perishable agri-exports. Instead of retaliating with matching tariffs or WTO complaints, Canada quietly froze expansion plans, shelved existing contracts with U.S. distributors, and reallocated cold storage exports to Asian markets, with minimal noise, maximum effect. And that's when Mark Carney stepped in. The former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, now Ottawa's global trade czar, orchestrated a stunning pivot. In late May, Carney traveled to Seoul and Tokyo, finalizing multi-billion-dollar trade agreements focused on high-grade Canadian agri-food exports, including, you guessed it, potatoes. By June, the first shipments of Canadian frozen potatoes landed in Japanese and South Korean ports, secured by long-term price protection deals. Less volatility, higher margins, stable partners. Exactly the opposite of what Washington had become under Trump's unpredictable tariff tantrums. Indonesia followed shortly after, signing a 5-year agricultural supply deal worth over 900 million Canadian dollars. Infrastructure upgrades at Prince Rupert and Port of Vancouver were greenlit to handle the surge in Pacific exports, with federal subsidies accelerating the shift. Back in the U.S., small businesses were left to deal with the wreckage. One diner owner in Flint, Michigan told a local paper, "I don't care about politics. I just want my potatoes." The US government decided to play tough, and now I'm serving fries from Bulgaria. They're awful. And it wasn't just diners. Food banks across the Midwest saw a 30% drop in donated potato products, as distributors prioritized paying customers over charity programs. School lunch programs in Ohio and Indiana began substituting processed carbs and grain-based sides. And farmers in Maine and Idaho? They were furious, not at Canada, but at Washington. Because the math didn't lie. US producers couldn't scale up fast enough. Their infrastructure had been hollowed out over years of dependency on cheap, consistent Canadian supply. Tariffs didn't magically create farms or processing plants. They just created pain, delay, and inferior substitutes. Meanwhile, Canada didn't stop growing potatoes. They just stopped sending them south. Instead, domestic supply was stabilized. Local retailers benefited. Surplus inventory was redirected to Canadian food banks and Indigenous communities. And processors in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island upgraded facilities with help from new Asian contracts, creating jobs, not killing them. It was, in every sense of the word, a trade reallocation, not retaliation. And here's the kicker. US officials didn't see it coming because they assumed Canada would react the way Washington does, loud, confrontational, and headline-hungry. But Canada's answer wasn't noise. It was exit. A surgical, emotionless decoupling from a trade partner too unstable to trust. And as Canada pivoted, the United States didn't just lose potatoes. It lost reliability in the eyes of its closest neighbor. But that wasn't the whole story. Because while Washington was busy downplaying supply issues, the quiet ripple effects were already reaching Wall Street, Asia, and the farms of southern Alberta. If the US thought this would blow over, they were dead wrong. By July, Wall Street analysts were flagging agricultural supply volatility as a sector risk, citing the potato shortage as a bellwether. Not just because of what vanished, but because of what replaced it. Inferior imports from fragmented suppliers across Eastern Europe and South America led to massive inconsistencies in quality, packaging, and logistics. Even national restaurant chains began quietly reworking menus. A leaked memo from a major fast casual chain revealed a shift to potato-adjacent side dishes and a full-scale halt to promotions involving fries. Food service providers warned of unresolved gaps in the North American cold chain. Meanwhile, Canada was just getting started. The deals signed with Asia weren't temporary fixes, they were long-term pivots. The Japan agreement alone included a 10-year commitment to Canadian potatoes, with built-in escalators, logistics funding, and exclusive supply rights for premium-grade varieties. And then came the domino effect. South Korea followed with a $1.3 billion CAD contract, this time including fresh and processed potatoes. Indonesia's agricultural ministry confirmed its new Canadian import package would replace US imports by 62% over 3 years. And the infrastructure race was on. Prince Rupert's Port began construction on a new agri-export terminal, with $240 million in federal and provincial backing. New cold storage facilities popped up in Saskatchewan and Alberta. CN Rail expanded its western freight lanes. And quietly, Canadian logistics firms began hiring, not hundreds, but thousands, to meet the demand. Smaller Canadian farms, particularly in Manitoba and the Atlantic provinces, struggled with the sudden pivot. Exporting to Asia required different packaging standards, tougher cold chain requirements, and longer timelines. Some family-run farms lacked the capital or scale to transition quickly. That's when Ottawa stepped in, again. Carney introduced the Agri-Diversification Fund, a $750 million Canadian dollars emergency support package aimed at helping smaller producers modernize, meet Asian export criteria, and buffer short-term losses. In a twist of irony, the fund was largely paid for by redirected revenues from now-defunct U.S. contracts. While Canada was restructuring trade, the U.S. was unraveling at the retail level. In the Midwest, diners began advertising limited fries on their windows. Wholesale potato prices surged another 16% in August, and reports emerged of restaurants rationing servings to avoid customer complaints. One Illinois-based supply chain co-op called the shortage the most avoidable crisis we've ever faced. And in a stunning blow to public confidence, the USDA quietly approved the emergency import of partially processed frozen potatoes from Vietnam, despite long-standing concerns about food safety and pesticide use. The backlash was instant. Social media erupted with images of pale, limp, chemically treated fries, and hashtags like #TariffTasteless and #BringBackPie began trending nationwide. But the most overlooked consequence? Trust. For decades, U.S. Canada agricultural ties were built not just on price, but on predictability. Processors on both sides of the border synced planting, harvest, storage, and shipment down to the week. That trust had taken 50 years to build, and 4 months to unravel. And yet, no one in the White House even acknowledged it. Trump, busy boasting about protecting American farms, didn't mention the shortages, the prices, or the growing dependency on unknown suppliers. His administration doubled down on the tariffs, calling them a permanent reset. But Canada had already reset without them. They weren't fighting a trade war. They were quietly withdrawing from one. And it worked. By September 2025, U.S. potato import numbers from Canada had dropped by 81% year-over-year. Canadian exports to Asia were up 44%. Domestic surplus was being used to strengthen food security programs across the country, from Nunavut to Nova Scotia. And while Canadian grocery stores offered stable prices and high-quality produce, Americans faced shrinkflation, substitute vegetables, and a loss of consumer confidence. All from one tariff. No declaration, no headlines, no war rooms, just a policy blunder, and a partner who chose not to play the game. But what came next? That would shake even the most optimistic trade strategists. Because when Carney sat down in Jakarta and signed a regional agricultural corridor deal worth over $2.2 billion CAD, including distribution rights, processing plants, and co-financed shipping lanes, it was clear. This wasn't just about food. It was a fundamental rewiring of supply chains. A post-American realignment of trust, logistics, and trade philosophy, where Canada, for the first time in decades, wasn't looking south. It was looking west. And as one analyst from the Brookings Institution put it bluntly, the United States didn't just lose potatoes. It lost the plot. And now, Washington stood isolated in a self-made tariff maze, unsure of how to undo a mess it wouldn't even admit to causing. But the consequences of this silence were just beginning to boil, and by the time Washington noticed what had happened, it was already too late. This wasn't a trade war fought with bluster and bullets. It was a cold, calculated exit, deliberate, quiet, and irreversible. Canada didn't fire back. It just left the room and took the potatoes with it. And in doing so, it exposed something far bigger than a tariff dispute. It revealed a fragile, outdated U.S. food system, overly dependent on allies it keeps antagonizing. It exposed how political chest-beating in D.C. can trigger food shortages in Des Moines. And it showed how a country like Canada, patient, strategic, and yes, silent, can dismantle decades of economic codependence without ever raising its voice. What's left behind? Empty shelves, soaring prices, broken trust, and a White House still pretending everything's fine, while Asian cargo ships filled with Canadian exports passed them by on the horizon. Because this wasn't just about potatoes. It was a test, and the U.S. failed. Now the question is, who else is quietly planning their exit? And how many more sectors, steel, grains, auto parts, even clean energy, will slip away before anyone in Washington realizes the world has moved on? If you found this breakdown valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Because in this new trade era, the silence says more than the speeches.